Nazi Germany will always be justifiably remembered as an evil empire. The depth of the depravity of that regime sends shudders down the spines of all decent humans. As a sick totalitarian government murdered millions of innocents, a serial killer stalked the women of Berlin. His reign of terror would be partially enabled by the hideous government who feared the optics of a killer running at large in the heart of Nazi Germany. Welcome to History is Criminal. I am your host, Mick Piddick. In this episode, we're going to take a look at one of the horrible events that would be overshadowed by the most horrible events in human history. As the Second World War raged and the Holocaust began, a serial killer stalked the unwitting women of Berlin. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, the government would make it easier for Paul Orgozoro to hunt his victims. Paul Orgozoro was born in Mohentan, East Prussia in modern-day Poland, in what was at the time Imperial Germany, on the 29th of September, 1912. His mother, Maria Seja, was a single mother and farm worker who would have had a tough time making ends meet. For some reason, he was adopted in 1924 by a farmer in Havelland, Germany, named Johann Orgozoro. He took the last name of his adopted father and worked as a laborer on his farm. And by all accounts, he was a totally unremarkable person. If there were hints of what he was going to become, they were not recorded. As the global depression of the 1930s raged, it ravaged the German economy. Orgozoro, like many people, looked for someone to blame for their troubles. He would join the Nazi Party in 1931. In 1932, he joined the paramilitary branch of the party, the SA. He would rank up in the organization, but never to any real point of authority. After Hitler took control of the government in 1933, Orgozoro's party connections helped him land a better job with the Deutsches Reichsbahn, the National Rail Company, working on the S-Bahn line in Germany. He was able to work his way up to assistant signalman in the freight yard, again in the Rumselburg district of Germany. He was married in 1937 and moved to Karlsruhe, where many of his victims lived. Co-workers described him as a competent and trustworthy man who often rode the train or his bike to work, but always wearing his train employee uniform. He most likely enjoyed the idea of the uniform giving him some feeling of pride and power. To his neighbors, it appeared that he was just a typical working father who, when not attending his vegetable garden, could be seen playing with his two children, a young boy and young girl. Then in August 1939, a serial rapist began to strike in the district where he lived in Berlin. With the outbreak of the war, the district was heavily populated with housewives whose husbands had been called to military service. He hunted the passageways and gardens in the areas between the apartments. As the city braced for possible Allied air raids, the nightly blackouts would set the stage for the perfect hunting ground. Women were being stabbed, bludgeoned, choked, and then raped and left for dead. Eventually, the police would be able to tie 31 attacks to Orgozoro. He was clearly attempting to kill his victims, but had not yet developed the ability to complete his task. Fortunately for many of his victims, he never became a very efficient killer. 3 of his victims would recover and later testify at his trial. In August 1940, one victim survived when Orgozoro stopped his attack. When she passed out, believing she was dead, a month later, a second victim would survive being thrown from a train. Gerda Cargill had worked a long shift before boarding the train to head home. Tired, she found herself getting comfortable enough to fall asleep. When she woke up, she had not only missed her stop, but more importantly, had ridden farther than the ticket allowed. In Nazi Germany, all travel was closely regulated. Gerda would have to quickly sneak on board another train heading back in the right direction. At the next station, she found a train heading towards her stop. Boarding the train, she located a seat in the third-class compartment. Orgazero spotted Gerda, who was clearly distressed and traveling alone in the third-class car. She would have been nervous and worried she could be fined or worse. When Orgazero offered to allow her to ride with him in the second-class car, she must have felt relieved. Orgazero, in his railway worker's uniform, would have had the perk of being able to ride for free in a second-class car. It took the police a little longer than it should have to realize that his victims had all ridden in the second-class car of the S-Bahn line. Orgazero chose this location because of the sparse number of passengers traveling second class. The majority of riders elected to ride in the cheaper third-class cars. Once alone with Gerda, he made his move, attempting to strangle her. Gerda would put up more of a fight than he expected. Orgazero was not a powerful built nor imposing figure. The assault was taking too long, and by the time she was unconscious, he knew he only had 5 minutes until they reached the next station. If nothing else, fascist rail systems ran on time. He dragged her to an open door and tossed her off the train. Then he threw her belongings after her, including her wallet. While he would later confess that he was a serial killer, he was no thief. Forensic pathologists would later claim that something about Paul Orgazero changed that night. Until this point, his attempted murders had been only to cover up his other crimes. Now, he found the thrill of killing. His crimes would remain sexual in nature, but his victims were now targeted for murder, with rape becoming almost secondary. Berlin police were about to make their first major screw-up in the case. It's hard to know how competent the Berlin PD were during the Nazi era. Party membership would have been given more importance than ability when it came to promotion. Resources would have been diverted to hunt enemies of the state or other undesirables. This would impact the department's ability to conduct meaningful police work. So when Gerda was discovered, it was determined that she had not been sexually assaulted, and her belongings were found nearby. So it was written off as a drunken accident or hoax. The police would think she threw herself from a train as a hoax is kind of insane. A drunken accident makes a little more sense. During the blackouts, bodies were being found along the tracks at a mind-boggling rate. In December 1940 alone, 28 people died on the tracks from, quote, blackout-related accidents. Now, I understand it was dark, but how hammered do you have to be to not hear a train coming? And just a word of warning, maybe don't walk down the train tracks drunk. His first murder, however, would take place not on the train, but in his old hunting grounds. He met a woman named Gertrude Dieter, whose husband had been drafted. She gave him her address. Why is not completely known. Maybe he had offered to help the 20-year-old mother too with chores around the house. Maybe he just seemed harmless. There is also the possibility that she recognized him. Before being drafted, her husband had worked at the same rail yard as Orgazero. But there's no evidence that they knew one another. On the night of the 2nd of October, during a blackout, he showed up at her door, and she willingly let him in. This led to speculation the two were meeting up for a tryst. As her children slept in the other room, the two talked long enough for her to let her guard down. Orgazero then grabbed the mother by the throat, squeezing hard enough to break her hyoid bone. That, however, was not the cause of death. He slashed her neck with a knife he was carrying, and she bled out on the floor of her home. Her body was discovered the next morning by a social worker. It had seemed that the state was in the process of taking her children away when Orgazero made her his first victim. Due to the involvement of social workers, the case was assumed to be suicide. But even the most incompetent police officers would be able to infer that a suicide would probably not break their own hyoid before cutting their throat. Police questioned Dieter's husband, who was stationed not far from their home. After hours of questioning, he was able to give detailed accounts of his whereabouts on the night of his wife's death. He was ruled out as a suspect. Lucky for him, German army was well known for its record keeping. With no new suspects, the case went cold. 1 month later, Orgazoro began his attacks on the S-Bahn line, focusing on an approximate 9-kilometer, that's just 5.5-mile stretch of track. On the 4th of November, he attacked Elizabeth Bendorf, a ticket seller at the train station. Using a piece of heavy lead-coated telephone cable, he bludgeoned her repeatedly. She lost consciousness twice, but each time came to. Running out of time, he threw Berndorf from the moving train. Unlike the attack on Gerda Cargill, the police didn't write this off as a drunken accident. He didn't take his weapon with him. He stuffed the heavy cable behind the seat cushions of the train. This time, the case would be given to the Serious Criminal Division of the Berlin Police. Detectives were able to narrow it down to the exact car that the attack had occurred in and recovered the hidden 20-inch long cable. The lead casing was stamped with a serial number that allowed officers to determine the location where the cable had been used. The police were starting to head in the right direction, but several issues would slow down the investigation. It would be again exactly 1 month later, on December 4th, that Orgazoro would kill 2 women within hours of each other. This pattern of striking exactly a month apart would be unknown to police because they had not yet connected the murder of Dieter with the attacks on the trains. This time, he found the 26-year-old nurse, Alfred Frank, riding along in the second-class car of the train. He would make sure this time that his victim was dead, striking her in the head at least 3 times with an iron rod until a fragment of her skull was driven into her brain. Once again, he threw the body from the train. Police discovered the body 3 hours later, while the city was still undergoing a blackout. Forensic pathologist Dr. Wieman was called to the scene. Noting that 3 women had been attacked and thrown from the train in close proximity, they now believed they were looking at one suspect. However, even though Dr. Wieman had investigated the murder of Dieter, no one had yet made that connection between it and the other attacks. What police couldn't know is that before they'd even arrived at the crime scene of Frank, not far away, 19-year-old Irmgard Fries would become Orgazoro's next victim. Having killed Frank too quickly, his psychosexual needs had not been fulfilled. He spotted the young girl walking home alone. In the darkness of the air raid, it had been easy to approach the girl from behind. He struck her hard across the head with his iron bar. It was hard enough to incapacitate but not kill. Then he tore off parts of her clothing and viciously raped her, leaving her for dead. Walkers in the area found her blood-soaked body and rushed her to the hospital, but she died, unable to say anything about her attacker. Police, however, were able to draw the conclusion that 2 attacks so similar and so close had to be the work of the same killer. After killing Fries, Orgazoro walked to a shack in a signal station on the train tracks and rested. He often slept in the shack instead of going home. This shack would place him in the middle of the killer's hunting ground at the time of the murders, a connection no one would make until it was far too late. That day, the case was assigned to Wilhelm Ludig, a veteran detective with the Serious Crimes Unit. Ludig had joined the force in 1910 and saw with the Nazi takeover the police become a revolving door for party members. Too often, the police had become part of the rounding up of political criminals at the expense of conducting any real police work. And while Ludig had tried to keep clear of the Nazis, by 1939, he found joining the party was the only way he could practically do his job. It would be Ludig who would make the connection between the attempted murders and rapes from earlier in the apartments and the killings on board the S-Bahn. He noted that once the murders on the train had started, the attacks around the apartments had stopped. From there, it wasn't a large stretch to connect them to the murders of Dieter. Just as the case was starting to gain ground, the Nazi government would sidetrack the case. A total news blackout was ordered. The government feared that news of the serial killer might harm wartime morale. It was also the opinion of the ranking party members that the police should focus their investigation on Romana or Jews who had not yet been deported to camps, or maybe they should look for foreign workers like a Pole or a Slav. Ironically, they refused to believe that an Aryan could be guilty of such horrible crimes, and surely not an actual party member. This bizarre view of the reality of the Nazi higher-ups held led to the deaths of at least 4 more women before Orgazoro could be brought to justice. He struck again just before Christmas 1940. 30-year-old Elizabeth Boninger rode the second-class car to see her husband, who was stationed in a nearby military base. Alone in the second-class car, it was easy for the uniformed Orgazoro to approach her. And while some rumors floated about attacks on the trains, the government had not allowed any official warnings to be made. Most likely, she would have thought nothing of the unassuming man in an official train worker's uniform when he entered the second-class car. She was beaten with a blunt object, but was still alive when thrown from the train. She died due to the impact injuries she received when hitting the ground. When the body was searched, a doctor's note was found stating that she was unfit for work. This led the police to at first believe her death had been a suicide. It seemed even communication within the Berlin police had been stifled. To some degree, the suicide was not completely unreasonable. Suicides were common around the holidays, especially among those who had been deemed of less value to the state. But the fact that she was a perfect match for the victimology of the S-Bahn killer seemed to go unnoticed until an autopsy revealed evidence of a beating. Only then did they conclude that she was a victim of the S-Bahn killer. On the 29th of December, he found another target on the second-class train near Rumselburg. Hedwig Ebauer. At this point, it would seem the police had to have an idea that where his strikes were going to occur and had the area under surveillance, but the Nazis were probably more interested in hunting enemies of the state than actually protecting civilian population. Ebauer was struck on the head with a heavy object and thrown from the train, but survived long enough to make it to the hospital. She would die later that same day. Police were able to ascertain the car where the attack had taken place. Unfortunately, by the time they were able to retrieve the car, it had been cleaned and evidence had been lost. Now 4 women had been killed and tossed from the S-Bahn. Others violently attacked. Despite the attempted news blackout by the Nazi government, rumors were starting to spread around Berlin about a maniac loose on the rails. The Berlin police had some clues. They had been told by an earlier survivor that her attacker was a railway employee dressed in a dark or black uniform. Orgazoro had also gotten lucky one time in his early attacks when he had been captured and badly beaten by the would-be victim's husband and brother. Unfortunately, they allowed him to run away after the beating instead of finishing the job or holding him for the police. His luck continued to hold out when he approached an undercover officer aboard the second-class car of the S-Bahn. The officer noticed him and prepared to detain him until backup could arrive. His gut told him there was something different about this would-be victim. Maybe she carried herself with too much confidence, or maybe she had made too solid of eye contact. Whatever it was, he got spooked and turned and ran for the exit. Now, for some reason, Berlin police didn't arm female officers. With the officer unarmed, he was able to escape by jumping from the train. This absolutely ridiculous act of misogyny allowed the killer to get away, to go kill again. It was around this time that a neighbor of his had hung a sign in a butcher shop warning of a killer on the loose. Alguazoro saw the sign, and the two began discussing the frightening news. The neighbor later recalled telling Alguazoro he could live next door. How he reacted to this is unknown, but his sick ego must have been polished. On the 11th of February, 1941, he found his next victim, 39-year-old Johanna Voigt. She had heard stories about a killer operating on the S-Bahn, so she must have felt at ease when she saw a uniformed rail worker at the station. There was no way she could have known that the round-faced, unassuming-looking man she approached was the S-Bahn killer. He would later tell how she asked him to ride the train with her as protection. Alone in the second-class car, he attacked. Like his earlier victims, she was bludgeoned and thrown from the train while still alive. And, like many others, she would also not survive the force of landing after being tossed from the moving train. It was after the death of Voigt that Detective Ludick noticed that she, like many of the other victims, did not have a ticket. This piece of information, plus the earlier description of what looked like a uniform, caused him to conclude that the killer had to be a ticket taker on the railway or a railway worker. Police tried to get more information out in the press, but the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, wanted to control the narrative, and little information was made available to the public. Police were able to offer a 13,000 Reichsmark reward for information leading to an arrest, but the reward worked too well as 15,000 tips flooded the headquarters, far too many to act upon. They also began to ask for volunteers to accompany the women home to prevent them from walking alone at night. Alguazoro would be one of the volunteers. Now, while it is said he was a perfect gentleman to any of the women he accompanied, he did, however, attack Voigt just after having left one of the women he had accompanied home. Police started to question railway workers on the S-Bahn. There were about 5,000 workers employed to work on the S-Bahn, and they were able to eliminate many of those that didn't meet the description given by survivors. With the increased police present, Alguazoro had to temporarily halt his attacks. He was biding his time until the police would settle down and let down their guard. Ludick decided it was time to take a gamble in order to draw out the killer. He had officers spread the word that as of the 1st of July, 1941, police would end surveillance of the trains as it wasn't doing any good. The plan worked to draw Alguazoro out of retirement. But again, his luck held, as he found a victim in a location not being watched by police. He followed a group of 9 women until one, 35-year-old Frida Kozol, separated from the group. Approaching Frida, he offered to walk her home, but she refused. He then followed her for a while before coming back from behind and hitting her with the iron bar. As she lay dying, he raped her, leaving her half naked. Ludick took some blame for the attack, but justified his actions by saying he wanted to catch the killer in the act. They did find a trail of footprints leading away from the crime. From the prints, they were able to tell the make of the shoe. Because of wartime rationing, it would be easy to get a list of all men who had bought that brand of shoe in that size. After eliminating all the men who had been sent to military service and those who lived too far away, they had a name: M. Hyman. Police seized Hyman and checked his shoes against the prints. The shoes matched perfectly. He had a criminal history as a peeping Tom. It seemed they had her killer. Ludick, however, wasn't convinced. Hyman had no connection to the S-Bahn other than having ridden it before. This would be one place where you have to give some credit to the Berlin police. They easily could have pinned the crimes on Hyman, and this would have eased the pressure they were feeling from the Nazi officials. The crimes were now being seen as an embarrassment to the regime. But based on forensic pathology and gut feelings, Ludick knew that unless they captured the right person, more women would die. And Hyman just didn't match what they believed to be true. That same July, police got their first major break in the case. It came from asking a relatively simple question: have you noticed anything suspicious about any of your coworkers? The Nazi government had been encouraging citizens to inform on each other since coming to power, so the question would have been nothing new to the people. But one worker did have something to report. One of his coworkers had climbed over a fence and left work in the middle of his shift several times, only to come back later before anyone else noticed. They had already spoken to this coworker, but dismissed him as a suspect when it was discovered that some of the crimes had taken place when he was at work. So police had released Paul Orgazoro, believing he was not involved. Now, with this new information that he had skipped out on work by hopping the fence, they wanted to talk to him again. On the 12th of July, 1941, at 6:45 a.m., police picked him up from his apartment. At first, he denied having ever left work, claiming his supervisor could corroborate this side of the story. But when pushed, he admitted to leaving work, but said he had been meeting a woman with whom he was having an affair. Police were not convinced they had the right man. Orgazoro was a family man, a loyal party member, and other than one coworker, no one had anything bad to say about him. As routine, his jacket was taken for closer examination. Microscopic examination found blood on the jacket. He explained the blood was both his and his wife's. She had been sick and he had attempted to help her. Never really explains what sickness she had that had caused blood. He said the rest of the blood had come from a cut on his hand. His wife surprisingly supported this story. Police didn't buy his story and believed the blood had come from some kind of struggle. Of course, there was no way of analyzing the blood, it being 1941, and honestly, given the time period, they were lucky to even find blood. The interview would have looked just like one from a 1930s gangster movie. A small, dimly lit room with a single light bulb hanging from a wire from the ceiling. He was confronted with the accusations of rape and murder. He admitted to stalking and scaring women, but denied anything more. Then two survivors of his crimes are brought in. One immediately identified Orgazoro. The other was unsure. Then, in a weird piece of police work, they took him to the apartments where his first crimes had occurred, and the victims were brought forward to identify him. While returning to the police station, he asked to speak to the officer in charge, likely hoping to meet a high-ranking Nazi officer that would allow him to use his party membership to get away. Ludick wasn't interested in Orgazoro's Nazi party standing. In fact, the party was now putting pressure on Ludick to close the case. For his part, the detective wanted a confession. He wanted to make sure that nothing could prevent the killer from meeting justice. When Orgazoro met with Ludick, he was presented with 5 skulls from his victims. Also present was Dr. Wieman, who explained the evidence to Orgazoro. Faced with the evidence against him, Orgazoro broke down. He began to beg Ludick to find a way to get him out of this mess. He was still hoping that his party standing held some sway. Ludick assured Orgazoro that he would be treated well if he confessed. Maybe Orgazoro took this as an assurance of one party member to another that all would be taken care of. This worked, and Orgazoro began to give detailed accounts of his crimes, starting with the first attacks in the darkened walkways of the apartments. He tried to justify his actions by blaming it on a venereal disease that he contracted 3 times, the first occasion in 1934 Poland. He also said it was made worse by the treatment of a, quote, Jewish doctor. He clearly hoped that this could be passed off with the work of a Jew taking advantage of a trusting Aryan. He claimed his illness had affected his state of mind, making him not responsible for his actions. So his defense is going to be that a Jewish doctor took advantage of this poor Aryan and turned him into a serial killer. That seemed like a stretch even for 1940s Germany. On the 18th of July, the newspapers finally ran a story detailing the attacks on the S-Bahn and ensuring the citizens that the killer was in custody. On the 22nd of July, he was put on trial for the murder of 8 women, the attempted murder of 6 others, and 31 counts of sexual assault. He tried once again to use his party membership to save his life, asking to be sent to a psychiatric hospital. The court, however, found him sane, that being a relative term, I'm sure. The party expelled him to avoid the embarrassment of a longtime party member being a serial killer. I know the irony, but he was killing Aryans, so the party probably cared. The trial was short and mostly for show. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by guillotine. Now, to me, that seemed a little ironic that the Germans were using a French invention in 1941 Nazi Germany, but hey, if it works, it works. 26th of July, he was executed, and as customary, bill for wear and tear on the guillotine was sent to his wife. Paul Orgazoro was an evil man living in an evil time in a country that was committing some of the most evil acts in history. What caused him to start preying on women in 1939 is unknown. Was he a demon waiting for the opportunity afforded him by the blackouts and the men away at war? Was he convinced that as a member of the ruling Nazi party, he would never be held accountable? Was it the start of the war with the invasion of Poland in September 1939 that acted as a triggering event for his violence? We'll never know. But what is clear is that the totalitarian regime of Nazi Germany, focusing on their own image, prolonged his reign of terror among the women of Berlin. The S-Bahn killer, a serial killer in Nazi Germany, is where I got the majority of the information for this episode. This has been History is Criminal. Come back again next time, and we're going to explore 3 of the most famous con men of all time. And if you wouldn't mind following us on Spotify and Facebook. If you liked what you heard, tell a friend. If you didn't like it, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.